And we're back. And as promised on line one, Scott Braddock. Good morning, Scott.
Morning, Dave. How are you?
Well, we're just pretty good. 29
Right.
degrees up here. It's a
Ooh,
little bit cold.
little bit chilly. We were not quite as cold as that overnight, although I did have my first freeze warning of the year here at the house. So I let the pipes drip. It's 33
Now,
now.
you're in Austin, right?
Yes, sir.
I didn't think it froze very often in Austin.
Not too much, no. And of course, we have the hills here, so whenever you do have freezing temperatures, the next thing that happens is there's always a news story about people walking outside on one of the sort of slanted sidewalks and slipping and busting their rear ends, and you got to watch out for that.
Yeah, another thing is y'all get snow about what, once every 5 years?
But once every 5-6 years, something like that. Very rare.
Yeah.
Very rare. Nothing like what happens up in the Panhandle.
So I'm going to make you explain something. I read a tweet, and this came out last night. It said the chief political strategist for Greg Abbott believes as many as 33 Texas House districts may be in play in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with that, what kind of decimation, I mean, just to be honest, would that do to the Texas House?
This is a very interesting situation. We've been talking about here on KFYO for months that it's a real threat for Republicans to lose the majority in the Texas House, right? And, we've talked about the fact that Democrats only need to pick up 9 seats for there to be a Democratic speaker in 2021. Governor Abbott's chief political strategist is a guy named Dave Carney, who you may have heard of. He was also the chief political strategist for Governor Perry, and he gave a presentation to some Republicans and Republican-allied organizations like Texans for Lawsuit Reform and the Associated Republicans of Texas. They had a meeting yesterday. It was closed door, but you know how we are with our sources at Quorum Report. We figure out what goes on in these meetings. And apparently his presentation included the idea that as many as 33 Texas House districts are in play. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are seats that would go to Democrats. Some of those, for example, one of the seats in western Harris County, in Katy, Texas, and one of the seats down in Hays County, which is just south of Austin. Some of those are seats that are held by Democrats now that could be taken back by Republicans. They're held by freshman Democrats right now. So it does mean that there could be a big scrambling of the board. And what we were told about this presentation was that the governor is sort of gearing up to be the backstop for Republicans, especially with the fact that you have Speaker Dennis Bonnen, who has sort of stepped aside but not stepped down. He said he's going to retire, but he's not resigning in the wake of this big scandal that we've been talking about here on the radio. But that means there's a vacuum in leadership. Usually, the Speaker would take the lead on trying to support those members of his own party who might have contested primaries and contested November elections. And with so much up in the air, you just can't have a vacuum like that if you're going to hold on to your majority. So the governor stands at the ready, apparently, to step in with some funding for those candidates.
Well, he's much more popular than Bonnen anyway.
No question, and he's absolutely the most popular politician in Texas. But not just helping in regards to sort of like endorsing candidates and things like that, but also paying for field operations. Block walkers, people to go knock on doors and say, "Hey, vote for Representative so and so because they did such a great job." Those field operations are expensive, and we're told the governor is willing to spend as much as about $150,000 per candidate who may have a contested race.
And that,
November,
to be honest,
which is pretty important.
One of the things that Abbott has been accused of in the past is being too tight with his war chest.
That's right. Even some Republicans have said that he's sort of hoarding money all for himself. Remember, in the last cycle, last year, he went into the 2018 election with more money in the bank than the Republican National Committee. He was at about $45 million, something like that. And so he can afford it for sure to help these folks. And don't forget that the Speaker, who is now stepping aside, as we say, he's got $3 million in the bank himself. He's got a PAC, a political action committee, that has $3 million. I was told in this meeting, it was made clear at the beginning that we're not here to talk about that. Don't bring up any of the Speaker's problems or what's going on with the Speaker. A senior Republican member of the House told me that the Speaker needs to cool off a little bit before anybody asks him about that $3 million and what they're going to do with it. But it should be said that when big money contributors are giving that kind of cash to the Speaker of the House, they're not just giving it to him. The intent is that when you give it to leadership, that they're going to use it to support other Republicans. So for him to hold on to that would be, I would say, just objectively, unbelievably selfish. So we'll see what he ends up doing.
So let me. This is not much of a move. I mean, we're still talking about Bonnen, but with Bonnen kind of not being in the race, this opens the door for something the Democrats have done before, which is to work with some of the moderate Republicans and possibly get a more moderate a guy in as the Speaker of the House. How likely does that look?
It could happen. I mean, the big topic of conversation has been whether the Democrats would take over, but it's a great question because, what if the Democrats don't take the majority but they just gain seats? What if we have 76 Republicans to 74 Democrats in the Texas House? That would set the stage for some sort of a deal like you're talking about. That's what happened in 2009 when Speaker Strauss came into power. The thing that I would take issue with, the framing that some people have used, is the idea that Bonnen was all that much more quote-unquote conservative than Strauss. And remember, you have all of these conservative groups running around now saying that Bonnen and the other Republican leaders, including Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick, presided over a session of the legislature that was not that conservative at all. They talk about a lot of the different priorities that conservatives had that just didn't go anywhere in this legislative session, and actually some conservative groups came together for a press conference in Dallas this week saying that there ought to be a special session to pass actual cuts to property taxes and things like that, not just capping property taxes like what was done in Senate Bill 2. So who knows what kind of a deal could come together, although I would say this, that idea that Democrats and Republicans would get together to elect a speaker, that was such a once-in-a-blue-moon kind of thing when that happened in 2009. I think there are some folks, even in the Texas House, who sort of think that that's one of the ways that you elect a speaker, but it was really just, that one time that it happened that way, and it really hasn't happened before or since.
Well, but it makes it the closer the Democrats get to the majority, or the less, I guess, the closer they get to being equivalent to the Republicans, the easier it would be for them maybe to pull a couple away.
Sure. I think the other thing that you got to keep in mind about how they're going to choose a speaker in 2021 is that the top issue, no question, is going to be the redistricting of the state, and that's going to, of course, be one of the most partisan battles that we see at the legislature, because that's all about which party is in control going forward for the next 10 years. So that actually sort of narrows the field for who might be chosen as speaker, who would be the person who would be trusted by the majority party to do as much as they could to shore up partisan control for, if it's Republicans for Republicans, if it's Democrats for Democrats. But I think it sort of narrows the field for who could actually be the presiding officer after Bonnen.
So today's the last day of early voting, and there's I think, 10 props, is that right?
Yes,
propositions. But the big one that people are talking about right now is Prop 4.
Yep.
I mean, how did Prop 4 come about in the first place?
Prop 4, of course, is this thing that I'm sure you've been talking about, has to do with trying to, quote-unquote, make it as impossible as possible to pass a state income tax. Of course, it's long been the joke in Texas that we'll have casinos in Baptist churches before we have an income tax in this state. And right now, the Constitution says that voters have to approve any proposal to impose an income tax. So right now, the law is that if the legislature wanted to enact an income tax, they would have to ask you first. They'd have to put it on the ballot. What this thing on the ballot today and, for Election Day next week says is that there would be a requirement that two-thirds of the legislature would have to vote to approve it, and then it would have to be approved by voters. So it just kind of raises the bar for passage of an income tax. To me, it seems sort of like a gimmick because, look, I see where the proponents of this keep talking about the idea that 70% of Texans do not want a state income tax. That's absolutely true, but that means that that Texans are never going to approve it.
So, in other words, it's easier to convince the politicians than it is the people.
Well, that's a good way to say it. I mean, you don't have you don't have some threat of an income tax coming our way any time in Texas. And do you remember back in, I believe it was 2005. Yeah, it was 2005. There was a thing called Proposition 2 that it was going to put it in the Texas Constitution that marriage is between one man and one woman. And it was already the case that gay marriage was illegal in Texas. And I remember talking to people at the time saying, what do you think about this? And people would say, well, I'm voting to keep gay marriage illegal. And I would say, well, you do know that there's no way you can vote on this to make it legal. And it's the same thing with this on the income tax thing. There's no way that you can vote on this today or on Tuesday that would make an income tax legal. And I'm just of the opinion that the Texas Constitution shouldn't be used as a gimmick. I mean, what this what they're really doing here.
Now, Scott, let's be honest though. Every other constitutional amendment, you have to still get the 2/3 vote out of the House and Senate, right? And so
That's right, and
So wouldn't it just be making it the same as any other constitutional amendment?
Well, yes, but my point stays the same, which is on this deal with the gay marriage amendment, there was no way you could vote on it to make gay marriage legal. And so on this income tax thing, there's no way to make it legal with an income tax. And here's what this is really about. This is about giving suburban Republicans in those districts where they're threatened that we were talking about previously, this is about giving them something to campaign on in 2020, something that everybody agrees with, right? That I don't like an income tax, you don't like an income tax, let's keep income taxes illegal. It's more of a bumper sticker than anything else. So I think however people vote on it is probably fine, but just remember that we're basically using the Constitution as a campaign prop.
So let me ask you this. I know we're running out of time here, but are there any other of the 10 propositions that you think need to be highlighted?
I think that this is a good one to highlight just because of what we were just talking about. The others are pretty much all very straightforward. I don't think there's any real controversy with any of the others. I know that there's one in there in particular that when you're going on the ballot and you see the one that's about infrastructure for water projects in rural Texas, that's particularly important, I think. But all the other ones are probably pretty innocuous.
Okay. Well, Scott, thank you so much for calling in and speaking with us. You're the editor of the Quorum Report, quorumreport.com. Real quickly, is there anything you want to highlight on quorumreport.com?
Well, we've got all the rundown on what happened in that sort of secret meeting yesterday as they're trying to assess, how to hold on to the Republican majority in the Texas House now that Speaker Bonnen is stepping aside. This is going to be a big conversation going forward. And, of course, you can always sign up for our free email alerts, what's going on with your state government, the real unvarnished news. As you can tell, I'm in that unvarnished mood this morning. At quorumreport.com, sign up for our free email reports, and we'll get you all the news you need to know.
All right, Scott, we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, thanks. Bye.